Identity is an after effect of the colonization of mental space and its botched decolonization. Culture is a symbolic pact. Once it materializes as heritage, as power, as appropriation, as identity, once it becomes signature, that is, the materialized image of this power, it is all over. We could repeat what Hannah Arendt said of power. Quote, "What saps and ends up by killing political communities is the loss of power and ultimate powerlessness. Power and culture cannot be stockpiled and kept for emergencies like instruments of violence. It exists only as act. Power that is not enacted disappears, and history demonstrates with a host of examples that the greatest material riches cannot make up for such a loss." That is what culture is in its highly singular and original form. Let us now look at what it has become globally. Culture, understood as cultural production and consumption, is made in the image of material production. And material production, since the 1929 crash, has existed in a state of overproduction or under the threat of overproduction. Already in 1929, growth was giving way to outgrowth. Ever since, this outgrowth and not growth has kept our societies in a state of increasingly acute crisis, interrupted only by wars and the economic recovery that destruction entails, the only cure for such excesses of growth. We can say then that the fundamental catastrophe remains the excessive growth that globalization does nothing but intensify. The other antidote to exponential growth, besides wars, is the stock market crash. However, the latter would appear to be less and less effective since it is now only virtual and involves only speculative funds and their overproduction. The same diagnosis could be made of culture, and the other crash threatening us is that of cultural overproduction. The powers that be would have us believe that in the cultural marketplace, unlike in the commodity marketplace, demand still exceeds supply and will continue to do so for a good while yet. People supposedly have an insatiable hunger for cultural goods, and so there would be a guaranteed boom in all cultural values. In fact, this is not at all the case. In the cultural economy of the average citizen, if such a thing ever existed, there is a noticeable surplus of supply over demand. It is just like at the supermarket. The unchecked promotion of cultural products already far exceeds human capacity to absorb them. Average people have no longer even the time to consume their own cultural products, let alone those of others. The public does its best. People flock to exhibitions, to festivals, but their capacity for cultural labor is stretched to the limit. An original form of cultural alienation ensues from this that is not due to lack or deprivation, but to excess and saturation. In this new context, the degree of cultural alienation, that is, of being held hostage by culture, by its ads, its media, its institutions, comes close to the degree of voluntary servility in politics. Suppose the public wants even more. One can never have too much of it. Well, that is a colossal illusion and error of perspective. The same is also said about information. Always more information, always more transparency are required. We can all see the effects that are as murderous as they are contradictory. However, the situation is even far worse in the case of culture. Culture can be a singular language, the idiom of a particular group or society, and in that case it has its own finality and is not at all infinitely extensible. On the contrary, its promotion and its proliferation would signify its death. It is indeed like languages. They both open onto an infinite internal complexity and are strictly limited in their structure and their material. If this were not so, they would not be languages. So either culture is a singularity of this kind, or else it is what it has become, a market with all the effects of artificial shortage, spiraling values, and speculation. As soon as one enters into this mercantile and exponential dimension that one tends to confuse with irresistible cultural progress, what looms on the horizon is the same reversal as occurred in the 1929 crisis with material production, overproduction, priority of supply over demand, the end of natural postulates about an economy that had become speculative, virtual, and completely cut off from real wealth and real economic requirements. This is exactly what lies in wait for culture and a cultural market turned speculative. Like Black Thursday on Wall Street in 1929, there could well be a Black Sunday of culture in the making. The expansion of cultural production far surpasses the expansion of material production, from which traffic jams ensue in the cultural domain that are even more monstrous than those experienced in the economy or on the roads. For in the open field of communication, anyone can produce gestures, texts, colors, signs, and meanings spontaneously and indefinitely in a kind of uninterrupted transit. Anyone can stage his or her own performance, unfortunately faced with the total indifference of the others, or with only their superficial consent. How could these countless productions all be taken on board? If to a certain extent we have managed to ward off economic crisis by opening cultural markets, particularly in France, where it was actually spelled out that culture served such a policy, who will save us from cultural overproduction when this market, in its turn, is saturated? Perhaps we will have to undertake a massive destruction of cultural values to save the sign value, the culture value, just as they once burned coffee in the furnaces of steam engine locomotives in order to rescue the world price of coffee. Already most non-material goods are meeting the same fate as material goods: forced production, forced advertising, accelerated recycling, built-in obsolescence. Art becomes ephemeral, not so as to express the ephemeral nature of life, but to adapt to the transience of the market. Rather than decadent, art is now degradable in line with the physical fate of a degradable world. Such is the fate of our cultural signs, no longer vested with a strong sign value. They are divested and travestied, confined to the pure and simple play of differentiation of degradable products. Multimedia technology is presented to us as a wonderful means of access to culture, a technology that is at last able to meet this need, this cultural demand. But the very terms of need and demand are completely false and reductionist. As for the expression access to culture, it is nothing short of monstrous with the impression it gives that we queue up at a box office window to finally get our cultural entitlement. What we have here is a frightening demagogy, placed under the dual signs of basic right and universal consumption. In fact, culture has become a kind of undifferentiated universal into which everything can be incorporated as separate elements which may be fractionated, disseminated, and consumed as quickly as they are produced. If everything is information, the corollary is that everything is culture. And if culture is a product, then indeed, it must be marketed. It must circulate. Everyone has a right to it, like the right to health care, and so on. Although we note that, as for health, the cultural deficit deepens with the exacerbation of demand, in the end, the consumption of health care and of medicines retains only a distant relationship with health. Similarly, the consumption of cultural goods is only remotely related to the singularity of culture. We are therefore forced to ask the question, what if information referred not to an event, but to the promotion of information itself as event? What if communication no longer referred to a message, but to the promotion of communication itself as event and as message? And last but not least, what if culture itself referred not to the world of the senses or the imagination, but to the promotion of culture itself as event or pseudo-event? It is at this point that McLuhan's 40-year-old formula becomes absolutely luminous. The medium has swallowed the message, and it is the multimedium that proliferates in all directions and in all its meanings. In the globalization of exchange, culture becomes another fetish product,